Welcome to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, The First 100 Days, Part 2, an online U.S. history tutorial for students in 11th grade. Repairing the nation's financial sector was essential work, but it did little to offer immediate help to the millions of Americans who were hungry and jobless. Providing this kind of relief in 1933 was still very controversial. There was very little precedent going back to the nation's founding for the federal government taking responsibility for the poor or the needy. The only exceptions had been during rare times of national emergency or during crises like the Civil War. Instead, churches, private charities, and sometimes state or local governments had played this role. There was great resistance to the idea of government giving people money directly, and not just from the conservatives and Republicans who opposed FDR politically, but from ordinary Americans themselves. In the 1930s, the ideas of self-reliance and an honest day's work for an honest day's pay were central to the character of this nation. The idea of taking money or accepting help, going on the dole, as it was called at the time, was seen as deeply shameful by most people, especially by men. For the most part, these unemployed men, the former breadwinners of their households, didn't want handouts, they wanted to work. But in the absence of jobs, what else could be done? In 1933, some American families were surviving day to day only by eating something called bulldog gravy. It was a mixture of water, flour, and grease. Some kind of relief was needed. In May 1933, FDR signed into creation the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA. Harry Hopkins was the agency's head. FERA immediately provided $500 million in grants to the states. The states, in turn, set up relief programs to feed the hungry. Through state programs, FERA gave $20 or $30 cash per month to as many as 5 million families. Harry Hopkins actually encouraged states to use the money to create work projects so that people could have the dignity of being paid for doing something, but in most cases, states chose to hand out the money directly. Despite the stigma that was attached, the dole provided the quickest, best way to get cash in the hands of the needy. In March 1933, FDR signed into creation a different kind of relief program, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. The Civilian Conservation Corps would become one of the most popular and longest-lasting of all New Deal programs. Instead of targeting family men who were former breadwinners, the CCC employed young men aged 18 to 25, the exact age group who might find themselves getting into trouble in the absence of something constructive to do. CCC projects all involved conserving natural resources in some way. Like his cousin Theodore before him, Franklin Roosevelt was passionate about preserving and promoting America's natural treasures. So the CCC boys were sent out of the cities to do healthy outdoor work in national parks, state parks, and national forests. They built hiking trails, roads, campgrounds, and lodges. They tamed soil erosion and shored up rivers to prevent flooding. They planted more than 2 billion trees. The 3 million young men who eventually worked for the CCC lived and worked under military-style discipline. Although they weren't technically enlisted in the armed forces, workers were housed in camps operated by the War Department. For their service, they were given food, shelter, and clothing, in addition to a salary of $30 a month. But $25 of that amount was sent home to the young men's families. The CCC lasted for almost a decade until 1942, the first year of U.S. participation in World War II. The trails, structures, and forests created by its workers remain today across this nation's landscape, one of the greatest tangible legacies of the New Deal. Another ambitious project designed to provide jobs while developing natural resources was the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA. FDR signed it into law during the 100 Days. The Tennessee River Valley region stretches across the state of Tennessee, but also incorporates regions of Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky. In the early 1930s, this was the poorest section of the poorest region of the country. Most residents lived in rural poverty, and as many as 90% still lacked electricity. The region was also overfarmed due to poor agricultural practices, and because of the undammed, uncontrolled river that ran through it, the valley was extremely prone to flooding. The purpose of the Tennessee Valley Authority was to build dozens of dams along the length of the Tennessee River to provide flood control and to generate hydroelectric power that would bring electricity to this impoverished region. President Roosevelt described the TVA as probably the widest experiment ever conducted by a government. He promised jobs for up to 200,000 men. Since its dams and power plants were to be constructed by a government corporation, the electricity the TVA produced would be government-owned power. Roosevelt believed that public power would provide an important counterweight to the privately owned companies that otherwise produced and sold electricity. He thought they charged too much and had left rural areas like the Tennessee Valley underdeveloped. Once the TVA started to produce power, overall electricity rates in the Southeast fell sharply. The region soon enjoyed many of the new technologies that urban areas of the nation had taken for granted for a decade or more. Ownership of electrical appliances tripled. Industries were drawn to the newly modernized region, creating more jobs there. Like other New Deal creations, the TVA had its critics. Private power companies fought against their new competition. Many local landowners in the region were suspicious of government agencies intervening, and as many as 15,000 families were displaced and needed to leave their homes because of new construction. In the long run, however, FDR could point to the TVA as one of the overwhelming successes of the New Deal. As one congressman described it, the TVA is not an experiment, it is part of American life. It is here, it will stay. The congressman was right. Like several other New Deal experiments, the TVA still exists today and continues its mission to manage the Tennessee River Valley and produce affordable power for its residents. During the New Deal's first 100 days, the Roosevelt administration took steps to help the dire situation of the American farmer. For farmers, economic depression had begun not in 1929, but a decade before, after the end of World War I. In general, American agriculture had suffered from a combination of overproduction and underconsumption. In other words, farmers supplied more crops than there was a demand for. Farm prices stayed so low for so long that farmers grew more and more crops, hoping to compensate for low prices by selling in greater quantities. But producing more only pushed prices even lower. In 1929, when the Great Depression began, farm income for the entire nation was about $6 billion, already historically low. But by 1932, farm income had fallen to $2 billion. The average farm family earned $167 in a year. These numbers represented an absolute catastrophe. Unlike the urban poor, farmers could usually feed themselves and their families when times were hard, but they couldn't pay their taxes, loans, or mortgages. As a result, many farmers saw their land repossessed, taken away from them by creditors when they could not pay their debts. What could be done? If overproduction was part of the problem, the simplest solution seemed to be to cut production. With fewer crops to buy, prices on those that remain should rise. Farmers would then have more money to spend, helping the entire economy. In May 1933, FDR signed into law the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA. Somewhat strangely, the AAA paid farmers not to farm. Those who agreed not to grow crops on a portion of their land, called an allotment, received a government payment for the crops they did not grow. Since many crops had already been planted at the time the law went into effect, the AAA's passage meant that some farmers had to destroy perfectly good crops to qualify for the payments. This led to a reality where American farmers were paid to slaughter animals and waste food, while in other more urban parts of the nation, other Americans went hungry at night. Roosevelt's Agriculture Secretary, Henry Wallace, called the destruction of healthy crops a shocking commentary on our civilization. I could tolerate it only as a cleaning of the wreckage from the old days of unbalanced production. The AAA was somewhat successful in restoring balance to the pricing of farm goods. Crop prices did rise, slowly at first, and by 1936, as FDR's first term came to a close, farm income had risen about 50% to $3 billion. Another lifeline thrown to farmers was the passage of the Farm Credit Act, signed into law in June 1933, at the very end of the 100 days. The act helped farmers who risked losing their land through mortgage foreclosures. The government extended long-term loans to farmers so they could stay on their land. The final puzzle piece of the first 100 days of the New Deal was industrial recovery. From 1929 to 1933, production had fallen more than 40%. Across America, factories lay silent. In large part, this was because industrialists were following a strategy not unlike that which FDR had pursued with agriculture. They had lowered supply to balance out the low demand brought on by the Depression. But closed factories meant millions of lost jobs for people desperate to work. Even workers who were still employed during the Depression typically faced lower wages, reduced hours, or both. This gave them little purchasing power, which depressed demand further, which kept supply low, and so on, in a vicious cycle. How to break the cycle? In June 1933, FDR signed into law the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, his administration's response. The act gave the president powers to regulate industry in order to promote economic recovery. Somewhat confusingly, the NIRA then established the NRA, or National Recovery Administration. This New Deal agency is not to be confused with the modern-day NRA, the National Rifle Association. The NRA encouraged industrial leaders in every part of the economy to work together to come up with rules called codes. These codes were supposed to end destructive competition and bring about conditions that would allow employers to stop cutting wages and jobs. The leaders in a particular industry, car manufacturing for example, were to come together to define fair working conditions for their entire industry. They would set minimum wages and maximum weekly working hours for employees. They would also set minimum prices at which goods could be sold. The point of these codes was to reduce competition and encourage cooperation among industries by establishing floors below which workers could not be paid and products could not be sold. This guaranteed higher prices and higher wages than would otherwise be the case. NRA codes achieved one other important goal. They set the general minimum age for employment at 16 or 18 for certain more dangerous occupations. This basically ended child labor in the United States, a goal that progressives had sought unsuccessfully for many decades. The NRA's practices were almost entirely new to American industry. President Roosevelt was asking business leaders not to do what came naturally in a capitalist economy, to outcompete each other. Many of the New Deal's critics called the NRA codes unrealistic, even un-American. Most business owners did comply with NRA policies, but many came to criticize them as too restrictive. The government tried to promote the NRA with a public relations campaign. The insignia of the Blue Eagle would be displayed on the windows or in the advertisements of businesses that participated in NRA codes. Consumers were encouraged to buy from those businesses and not from those who wouldn't participate. Unlike some other New Deal programs, the NRA actually became less popular as time went on, and its policies were only somewhat successful in increasing industrial production. By the time it ended in 1935, industrial production had increased by only about 22%. But to achieve this increase, according to some economists, NRA codes may have actually increased the cost of doing business by as much as 40%. By June 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's first 100 days in office came to an end. By any measure, it was an historic time in American history and the beginning of an historic presidency. With Congress and the American people on his side, FDR had signed 15 major new laws. The most important of them, the ones that really transformed American society in visible ways, were the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. President Roosevelt took one other action during his first 100 days that was extremely popular with most Americans. He legalized some alcoholic beverages for the first time since 1920. Prohibition had been the law of the land for 13 years, but most Americans had come to regard it as an utter failure. By 1932, when FDR ran for president, the idea of re-legalizing the liquor industry to create jobs and revenue held wide appeal. Roosevelt ran for office promising to end prohibition, and his election virtually guaranteed it. Even before FDR was inaugurated, Congress adopted a resolution proposing a 21st Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment would end prohibition by repealing the 18th Amendment, which had started prohibition. The 21st Amendment would not be fully ratified by the states until the end of 1933, but the new president gave Americans a head start by signing into law the Cullen-Harrison Act, also called the Beer-Wine Revenue Act. This legalized the sale of low-alcohol beer and wine. After signing the law, Roosevelt is said to have remarked, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." FDR's 100 days didn't end the Great Depression, and according to some historians, neither really did the rest of the New Deal, which would unfold in several more phases throughout the 1930s. It's a complicated issue that's explored in other tutorials in this series. What the New Deal did do was to change forever the relationship between Americans and their government. It expanded the size and scope of that government and made it responsible for many more aspects of citizens' lives. It also established the beginnings of a social safety net, a welfare state, that would help Americans in need. Some of these changes remain debatable, but no one doubts their impact. By its end, the New Deal would create a very different America than the one that had existed before FDR took office. America would never turn back to the status quo before the Great Depression and Roosevelt's inauguration.